This is a 1994 Acura Legend Coupe, and it's cool. Well, by modern standards, it maybe isn't especially cool, but I remember back in the day when this thing came out, it was cool. An Acura, besides the NSX, that was cool. It might be hard to believe considering Acura's current status as a brand devoted to building near luxury crossovers, but it was. And today, I'm going to show you around it. I've borrowed this Legend here in Southern California from Clarion Builds, which is a program from Clarion designed to appeal to car enthusiasts by restoring and preserving modern classics like this one. Here's a brief overview of the Legend. Now, Acura beat Lexus to the luxury sedan market, and the Legend was Acura's flagship model. It came out back in 1987, and it was redesigned in 1991 to look like this. Most of the second generation Legend models like this one were actually four-door sedans, and you could only get a 3.2-liter V6. But in 1993, the Legend lineup expanded to include a coupe. And not just a coupe, but a coupe with an available 6-speed manual transmission, which this car has. And it was better than that. While the Legend sedan had only 200 horsepower, and most of them used a 4-speed automatic, this car had the 6-speed manual and 230 horsepower, a nice little power bump. And the 6-speed manual was a pretty big deal back in 1993. Back then, every single Ferrari model was still using a 5-speed manual, so getting that extra gear was pretty cool. Unfortunately, it didn't last long. The Legend was redesigned in 1996 to become the RL, and the coupe and the power bump were gone. But for a few years in the mid-1990s, this was the coolest Acura on the road, aside from the NSX. Of course, most people haven't thought of the Acura Legend in years, but today, I'm going to remind you of it. I'm going to take you on a tour of the finest Legend of all, a beautifully preserved 6-speed manual coupe, and I'm going to show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Legend by getting inside. Well, actually the opposite, by closing the doors. Check this out. This car has soft close doors, meaning if you don't quite close the door all the way, the car will automatically latch it closed for you. So you don't have to ever slam the door. You can be far more luxurious with your door closing approach. Now, this is a huge deal for a 1994 car. This feature is now on Bentleys and Rolls-Royce and other really high-end sedans, but you won't see it on like a Mercedes E-Class from today, yet it was on this Acura Legend 25 years ago and it still works. That's pretty cool. Now, when you open the door, one other interesting electronic item occurs. You open the door and the seatbelt moves. Not because this car has those automatic seatbelts that go down some track like a lot of 90s cars. Instead, this car has airbags, so it doesn't need those seatbelts. But what happens instead is that the seatbelts automatically move out of the way on the bottom. This allows you to get into the car easily. When you then sit down and close the door, the seatbelts automatically move back towards you so that it's easier to reach the seatbelt. The theory here is since this is a coupe with big doors, it might be hard to reach the seatbelt, so Acura wants the seatbelts to be able to be delivered to you when you close the door, which was a pretty forward-thinking idea for a 1994 vehicle. Now, since we moved inside, I want to start with the door panel, and I want to talk about just how beautiful it looks. Look at this perfect, brilliant door panel. The leather is absolutely flawless, and so is the rest of the interior of this car. I have been in new cars that don't have leather that looks this good. There's a secret to it. Clarion Builds actually sort of refreshed this whole thing. Everything is new. Even though this is how it would have looked as it was sitting in the showroom back in 1994, it has been sort of lovingly restored and brought back to its original glory. It is beautiful to see basically how this car would have looked as if it was new. Now, one other interesting item on the door panel besides the beautiful leather, you have a power mirror control over there. Not all that surprising, but you also have a heated mirror control. That is kind of surprising. That's a nice feature for a car like this. I also like the fact that the button for it is this little tiny button. You just tap and you turn on your heated mirrors. Another unusual control for this car, to the left of the steering wheel, there's a little dial that says courtesy light. I couldn't figure out what this is, but it turns out the courtesy light is is Acura's name for the footwell lighting in the driver and passenger seat. And if you want to drive around for some reason with the footwells lit up, you can do that by turning on your courtesy light, or you can sort of dim them, or you can turn them off completely. A very unusual feature that modern cars don't have, but Acura thought people might want, so they put it in this one. Next up, another nice luxury car feature in this vehicle. It has a tilt and telescoping steering wheel, and it's power operated. There's 4 individual buttons to the left of the steering wheel you can use to move the wheel up or down. Not all that surprising from a luxury car for this era, but pretty cool. I also like the fact that there is a little switch over there that says auto, on or off. If you turn it to on, the steering wheel will rise out of the way when the door is open so that you can get in and you'll have more room. If you turn that off, then it won't do it. It's a nice little configurable feature. Also, to the left of the steering wheel and to the left of the gauges, there's a button over there marked roof. That's the sunroof control. Very strange placement. Usually it's up here sort of on the ceiling so both driver and passenger can reach it, but not in the 94 Legend Coupe. In this car, the sunroof's opening and closing was solely determined by the driver. Next up, in the gauge cluster itself, pretty standard 90s Japanese car gauge cluster, nothing particularly unusual, although it does have a little light, and under it says maintenance required. Apparently that light will turn on if you need to do maintenance to your 94 Legend Coupe. Another interesting item in this vicinity, if you leave the headlights on and turn off the car, you get a bizarre warning chime. Take a listen. Now, this warning chime is only bizarre by modern standards. Back in the 90s, this was actually a fairly common sounding warning chime in cars. Today, it would be considered ridiculous. It sounds almost like Christmas music, but that was the warning chime you got if you left your lights on in your Legend. Next, we move on to my very favorite quirk of this car, and that would be the clock button thing. Okay, so you have the clock in the middle, and then to the right of that, you have this little plastic thing. That is a little cover. If you pull it down, you will see the clock adjustment buttons, which makes sense. That's not particularly noteworthy, except when the car is off, if you press that cover as if it was a button, it will temporarily display the clock, the time. So that thing has 2 functions. It's a little door that hides buttons, and then it's also a button itself. I don't know why they bothered going to the trouble of engineering that, but they did, and it's pretty cool and kind of unusual. Next up below that, you have the climate controls, and there is something very unusual about it. If you look at the climate controls, you'll notice there is no button where you can choose where the air comes out, and there's no dial where you can choose how much air, the fan speed. Instead, the climate control is all auto, and you can see it says auto, and the buttons are very limited. Except there are hidden manual buttons. There are 3 buttons across the center of the climate control. It says manual select, but otherwise these buttons are not described. The one on the left allows you to change where the air comes out. The one in the middle turns on or off the AC. The button on the right adjusts the fan speed, but it only raises it. If you want the fan speed lowered, you just have to keep tapping that button until it goes all the way through to the top fan speed and then back down to the bottom. It's very interesting climate controls. They basically wanted to force you to use automatic climate control. They only included these little manual buttons because they had to, and they made them very small. Speaking of climate control, this car has heated seats, which isn't incredibly impressive for a luxury car from this era. A lot of them had them. This car has an interesting thing though. It has these heated seat sliders, and there are 5 different positions you can slide them to. For if you want it to be just a little hotter, but not quite that much less hot, you can dial in exactly your perfect seat heatedness. Next, we move on to the glove box. Nothing especially unusual here, except if you open the glove box, there is a little switch that allows you to lock out the trunk. So if you hand off your Legend Coupe to a valet, the valet won't be able to access whatever you have in your trunk. Next up, moving on to the ceiling in the center where the sunroof controls probably should be. Instead, all you have up there are dome light controls. Off and on, you can turn on the main dome light, but I especially like the little tiny map lights. You can also turn on very, very small little dainty map lights, but you can use them if you must read a map while you're driving or riding in your Legend Coupe. Next up, moving on to the center console, this car has something I absolutely love. The center console is hinged so that only the driver really has access to it, and when you open it, there's a little warning label in there that says, "Notice, do not drill or install screws, SRS components located under this compartment." Apparently, there were airbag components under here, and if you drilled, you might damage the airbag system. It seems though like a very important item. You don't want to drill into your center console. Not sure why you'd be doing that anyway, but you shouldn't, because you might screw something up. Now our next interesting item is climbing into the back of the Legend coupe, and there's something unusual about this. Acura made it a lot easier to climb into the back of the passenger side than the driver's side. The driver's side has this little latch that you can use to push the seat back forward, but the passenger side has that latch and also a little power control located above that latch that made it easier to move the seat forward for rear seat access. The driver's side, the seat will go forward just as far, but in order to move it forward, you have to reach all the way down to the power seat controls and move it forward, which made it just a little bit more annoying to get in on the driver's side compared to the passenger side. But of course, I will now get in, since that's what I do. And actually, it's not all that difficult to get in to the back of the Legend coupe. And once you're back here, there's a decent amount of space, which is kind of surprising. Now, 3 interesting things about the back seat of the Legend coupe. One is the fact that the rear windows rolled down, which is pretty impressive. Most coupes, even today, the rear windows don't roll down, but in the Legend coupe, they did. A nice little touch. Another nice touch is the fact that both rear passengers had their own individual ashtrays, as if this was like a Rolls-Royce from 1976. I don't know why they think that the rear passengers need those ashtrays, but they're here just in case. Probably the most interesting item in the back seat, however, is the fact that on the rear shelf, there's a little hidden storage compartment. If you ever want to hide something that no one's going to get to, put it in there. It's hard to even reach it from basically any position, but it's back there in case you have something you really want to get out of the way. Next, we move on to the rear of the Legend coupe, and specifically onto the trunk. In order to open it, you stick the key in it, twist it, and then you notice that the trunk is rather large, especially for a 2-door vehicle. This is a surprisingly sizable trunk. Other than that, though, it is just a trunk with nothing especially unusual about it. If you pop open the floor of the trunk, you will see there's a little foam piece next to the spare tire. I think that's for sound deadening. This is a luxury car, and they don't want the spare tire to rattle around back there, so they stick that foam in to keep it from rattling. That is the mark of a true luxury car. Another mark of a true luxury car was that when you got a Legend, you got keyless entry, and here is what the key fob looks like. You can see it's leather wrapped. They wanted you to have the nicest key fob. No plastic for you. There are 2 buttons on it. One is lock and unlock, and the other button is the panic button, all wrapped in leather with a little snap on the other side in case you needed to pull it out to change the battery. Next up, we move on to the front of the Legend, and specifically the front turn signals, which, as you can see, are fairly normal. You got one here, you got one in the bumper. You can put them on to let other drivers know when you're going to make a lane change or a turn. Seems simple enough, but it isn't really. This is the turn signals when the headlights are off. When the headlights are on, the 2 turn signals alternate. This one blinks, then the one in the bumper blinks, and they alternate like sort of twinkly Christmas lights. Very strange. I don't know why they did that. Maybe for visibility when the headlights are on, you want to see a little bit more clearly that the turn signals are on independently. Seems odd, but that is definitely a quirk of the Acura Legend. One other item I like up front is the grille. Look how thin and small this grille is. This would never fly in the modern era of giant corporate grills where every car has to have a spindle or a face or a tiger nose or whatever it is. This thing just has a little thin Acura grille. Not very distinctive, but that's what it has. And speaking of that front grille, it's worth noting something interesting about the Acura logo. Have you ever noticed that the Acura logo is just the Honda logo, but flipped upside down, and then they pinched it at the top to make an A? Take a look at this. You may have noticed this already, but I don't review that many Acuras, so I figured it was worth mentioning because I recently noticed it. It's easiest to see when you're looking at the Acura logo upside down. It's just the Honda logo, but changed, which is sort of a nice metaphor for what Acuras are. And speaking of Honda but different, we open up the hood and you can see the engine. No plastic engine cover here. It says Honda Motor Company all over the sides of the engine to really emphasize that it was in fact a Honda, although that isn't the thing they've chosen to be in the very middle of the engine. The thing they're most proud of is the fact that it's a Type 2. I find that funny because no one really cares about that anymore. I mean, Type 2, hey man, you want to check out my Type 2? Yeah, you got a Type 1, but I got a Type 2. But at the time, it was such a big deal that Acura felt it was more important than placing Honda or Acura or even 3.2 V6. That's all on the side, and Type 2 is front and center. And so those are the quirks and features of the Acura Legend Coupe, the pinnacle of Acura's luxury lineup from 25 years ago. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Legend Coupe. This car really was something back in its day. This was, you know, we didn't know what would happen to Acura, Infiniti, or Lexus. And Acura, this was sort of the heyday. They kept coming out with the NSX and this, the Integra GSR, and this thing was awesome. It's a cruiser, which makes it kind of funny that they had a manual and a 6-speed manual to boot. Long throws in the gear lever, surprisingly long throws by modern standards. The clutch is soft is the right word. It's got a long travel and the engagement point is unusually vague. Nonetheless, this does feel like a relatively competent luxury car. The seats are very nice, surprisingly so for a car from this era. They feel obviously nice and soft, but also reasonably supportive, more so than a lot of 90s car seats. This car is definitely soft in terms of steering and handling. The steering is very soft. You're not intended to be throwing this thing around corners. There's a lot of body roll. It's a big-bodied coupe. It really is. It's like a serious big coupe. Not intended to be a sports car, just sort of a sporty car. And that came through when you tried to throw it around corners. Again, the gears, this thing does not have short throws in the shifter. It is not incredibly fast. 230 horsepower is not really all that much, especially for a vehicle like this. And of course, this is a front-wheel drive car. I don't want to say the body roll is like excessively terrible. It's not, but it certainly isn't planted or stiff like a sports car. Oh, going into that corner, man, there is some roll, and the steering is not tremendously precise. This is more of a cruiser. I've got it on a fun road because you kind of want to experience the limits, but the limits are pretty easy to experience. In fairness, the interior though is nice and it looks nice. It doesn't look dramatically nicer than a lot of 90s Japanese cars, even luxury ones. But I guess back in the day, you'd throw some wood grain in and people are like, oh, things have changed now. You have to do more to delineate yourself as a luxury vehicle. It does have some power. It's reasonably peppy when you floor it. It's quick enough, but it's not fast. This isn't a car that I think anyone would ever accuse of being like actually fast. It's just relatively quick for what it is. Steering also takes a bunch of rotations in order to make a U-turn or whatever. It's a soft, the steering is light. And I don't want to say all bad things about this car. It is a pretty nice car. Again, the seats are nice, luxurious. I like how everything looks. This one is just beautiful, and I could totally see why someone would have spent big money for this car back then. The flagship Acura, you know, the coupe with the manual, if you wanted to relive your glory days, but you didn't want something like a Porsche or anything like that. This was a special car back then, and again, you know, the Japanese luxury brands were just coming on the scene. They had this sort of wow factor, and no one knew that Acura would then experience a decline, frankly. At the time, Acura was looked at as a reasonable alternative to Lexus, maybe down market, but still new and hot. And this was a very special car from this hot new brand. This car is certainly good. There's no way you can say it isn't. It's comfortable. It has good visibility. It feels good. It drives well. It's not a crazy sports car. It's not a crazy luxury car. It's just sort of this in-between thing. Back in the 90s, when this thing was new, when I remember it new, it definitely felt a lot cooler than it does today. And so that's the Acura Legend Coupe with the 6-speed manual. This car may not seem all that cool by modern standards, but I remember back in the day when this thing came out, it was a special car. And as manual transmissions go away, and as cars go away, and as Acura trends towards building more family luxury crossovers, this is certainly an interesting trip back in time. And now it's time to give this car a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Legend Coupe is nice, and I've always liked the look, but if I'm objective about it, it now mostly just looks like an older 1990s Japanese car, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Acceleration 0 to 60 is somewhere in the mid to high 7-second range, and it gets a 1 out of 10. Handling is okay, but not exceptional, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Fun factor is surprisingly low. You'd think the coupe manual version of a car would be a lot more fun, as I'm sure this was back in 1994, but time has moved on, and this isn't as thrilling as it once was, and it gets gets a 3 out of 10. Finally, cool factor. Seeing a Legend coupe with a 6-speed in this kind of condition is pretty cool, and it would definitely raise a few eyebrows at Cars and Coffee. It gets a 4 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 17 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The Legend was well equipped for its day, though obviously times have changed, and now it gets a 3 out of 10. Comfort is good with nice soft seats, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Quality is high, the build quality is good, and reliability is very strong, though materials haven't aged so well. It gets a 7 out of 10. Practicality is normal for a car like this, with an acceptably big back seat and a large trunk, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Finally, value. These are cheap, but they're also not particularly exciting. They may be on their way to classic status, but they aren't there yet, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 26 out of 50. Add it up, and the Doug score is 43 out of 100, and here's how it compares to other 1990s Japanese cars I've reviewed. Mostly I've only reviewed 1990s Japanese sports cars, and the Legend can't compete with actual Legends like the Supra Turbo, but the Legend ties the Lexus LS400. The Acura wins in the weekend categories, the Lexus wins in the daily categories. That seems about right.
Next we move on to the glove box. Nothing particularly unusual here, just a glove box, although if you open it up, you will see there's a little switch that allows you to turn off the trunk. So if you turn off the trunk, that's interesting. Next we move on to the glove box. Nothing especially unusual here, except if you open the glove box, there is a little switch that allows you to lock out the trunk. So if you hand over your Legend coupe to a valet, the valet won't be